NFL never sweeps. And I guess that's good for us who study the draft and study the NFL, but it's also bad for us because it means we never sweep as well. But we've got a good roundtable that I'm really looking forward to today. Dan and I have done shows before, but Matthew Freedman, this is the first show that we're doing with him. So we're welcoming Matthew to the mix here. Guys, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on the show.
I'm doing well, Ron. We had an interesting draft process this year. A lot of crazy stuff, or at least more crazy than I thought it was going to be. So, a little upset about some of those picks up there, particularly the Falcons. I have no idea what that was.
Well, today we've got a busy agenda. First round was dominated by quarterbacks in the draft, but it's more than quarterbacks. Now that they're on their teams, we're going to talk about what their projections might be and from each of our perspectives. And we don't know each other's perspectives yet. So that's going to be interesting and fascinating for me to hear as far as what do we think are the ceilings and floors for these quarterbacks. We've got some wide receivers to talk about and some organizations that are either starting from new or changing how they do business. That's our agenda. But before we actually start in on the quarterbacks, I thought the first thing that we could do is kind of look at the 2024 NFL draft takeaways. And we listed a few of them here. Just our parting thoughts. We're about 2.5 weeks removed from the draft. It seems like a long time ago in some way, shape, or form. But Matt, start us off. The quarterbacks went early. That was one of your first impressions.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really stood out, not just that the quarterbacks went early, but this was, I mean, it's kind of unfathomable to think about. Like that 1983 class of quarterbacks, an all-time great class. 6 guys went in the first round in that class. We had 6 go in the top 12. And it just felt like a massive overreach on the part of the league. And that's not to say that like none of these guys is going to turn into a star or anything like that. But at no point in the draft process did any, prognosticator, draftnik, scout, whatever, at no point did someone say this might be the best quarterback prospect class of all time. Right? No one said anything like that. Some people kind of ventured into that, like territory, maybe with the 2018 class. Some people said things like that with the 2021 class, and we had 5 quarterbacks in both of those classes, but no one said anything like that at all this year. And we got 6 quarterbacks in the top 12, which I think just really indicates that some teams massively reached on some of these guys. And we can talk about, who those guys might be when we get to the quarterbacks. But that was one thing that really stood out to me, just the quarterback hungriness of some of these teams in round 1. And then, of course, just how offense dominated the first night of the draft with, was it the first 14 players in the draft being offensive players, easily a record, the most offensive players going in round 1, a record this year. And some of it is maybe just kind of the way the league is going, but a lot of it was a stacked class at some key offensive positions this year. I wouldn't expect that to be a trend going forward, but this year it was something that definitely stood out, and like that was foreseeable that we would have a slew of offense going in round 1.
Yeah, it's interesting because when the dust settled, the tea leaves were saying 5 or 6 quarterbacks were going in the first round, but in the top 12, that didn't really compute. And we could talk more about the quarterbacks when we get to that quarterback class, but that's going to be interesting in terms of why they went where they went. For me, the first takeaway was I thought this draft was pretty predictable as to who the top 30, 35 players were. What wasn't predictable necessarily was where they were ranked. We had, 8 or 9 offensive tackles, depending on where you put Barton and where you put one of the other guys, I think it's the Penn State guy, as tackle or guard. in the first round. We had a top heavy offensive tackle class, but not everybody had the same offensive tackle rated second, third, or fourth behind Joe Alt. We had some wide receivers at the end of the round that were either first round targets or close to first round targets, and the order of those was kind of different. Some of the order for quarterbacks was a little different too. I thought it was pretty predictable as far as though what the first 30 or so players were going to look like. It's not always that way in drafts because I've covered a lot of them. So that was interesting. Guys like Bowers, guys like Murphy, I had no clue where they were going, and I still don't know why they ended up, why Bowers ended up where he did. But certainly, no one would dispute that he was a top 15 or top 20 talent for sure. Dan, you have one I threw in there, and you're probably shaking your head. Same teams make the same mistakes all the time.
That's pretty much my notes. The Falcons, we'll dive into Penix here on the next slide or two with the QBs and the Jaguars. The Falcons took Penix. I still can't believe they took him at 8. And the other move in that round 2, they had made a massive reach at that defensive tackle who was really athletic, but not very productive out of Clemson. I think he was 13 ACC, didn't get many sacks. He had some pressure, but wasn't top round 2. I thought he was closer to round 3 type grade. It just seems like if you're going to trade up for a pass rusher, why don't you just take one at 8 and then trade it for Penix if you really wanted a pass rusher? That was one I was kind of surprised by. Jaguars doing Jaguars things. Trent Baalke, once again, just reaching for guys. They needed a wide receiver, but when you trade down and your biggest need is press man corner and Teron Arnold was on the board at pick, I want to say 23 territory, I don't know why you would take Brian Thomas Jr. I think he's going to be good in the league one day, but that was not your biggest need. And then in round 2, they took a defensive tackle out of LSU. He had some injury concerns for most of his career until his last part of his year. So that was just a guy who Jaguars probably need another pass rusher, but it just seems like they don't want to acknowledge that back end. It just seems like Jaguars are a team who have some issues again this year and didn't actually solve. Broncos we'll discuss with Knicks, but overall, dumb teams doing dumb things again. So, Ron, keep your notes for Falcons and Jaguars next year because you and I already have those.
I want to second what Dan said there, especially with the Falcons. We'll talk about the Penix pick at number 8, whatever. But it was the second round pick that really just kind of, I wouldn't say threw me off, but just put me on mega tilt with the Falcons, where they traded up to take Rukaroro when Jerzon Newton was on the board and could have been a first rounder. So it's like they just kind of went out of their way, arguably, to take the wrong guy. It just kind of incredible. And then, yeah, absolutely with the Jags, it felt like they were reaching with every pick outside of Brian Thomas in round 1.
Yeah, controversial opinion that probably won't go into too much detail on this show, but I do not like the trade value chart. And the 2 best examples I have are Atlanta and the Lions. You would say, wow, the Lions gave up a first and a third. They went up 29.73, I think, for 24, which doesn't seem like great value. But what if I told you the person that they picked at 24 had a grade of 13? If you said that they traded 29 and 73 for pick 13, you'd say that's great. So trade value is all in the eyes of the beholder. With the guy that you guys mentioned that was picked I think it was pick 35, and the Atlanta Falcons went from 43 to 35 to get him. Well, that doesn't make sense on my trade value chart because they traded 43 and a third round pick to get a guy who I rated as a third round target. Yeah. Basically, they traded 43 for 75. So that points to Dan's assertion that maybe some teams didn't do the greatest job in this draft.
I do want to ask both of you with the Falcons at least, do you think the GM is doing one thing and the owner does his own thing? It just seems like there's a disconnect on that team already. And I do wonder when this is going to come back to haunt them. I don't know if it's going to be this year, but if Kirk Cousins isn't very productive, he's going to have his game or 2 stretch where he's just not very good. when do we see the Penix chance start? When do we see kind of some friction between the owner and GM? And I think this coach is going to be fired here real soon, the next 2 or 3 years, if they keep going this way.
I think owners generally get involved when it's quarterback talk. Beyond that, they're going to have to trust their GM, or they shouldn't have hired him in the first place.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think, it's hard to know what the GM and coach really thought about, hey, let's double up on quarterback. That feels like an ownership mandated type of move. Because I think otherwise it's really hard to think that the general manager and head coach would want to do that, even from a locker room perspective of putting those two guys in that situation. That feels like something like football guys would be desirous not to do. So that feels like that's an ownership type of thing of like, hey, I don't like how things have gone since we lost Matt Ryan. Let's make sure that we never find ourselves in a quarterback purgatory again.
Yeah, at different philosophies. We remember that when RG3 was drafted, Kirk Cousins was actually drafted in that same draft. So it's funny how things come around, go around, and so on. One other interesting takeaway, or another one that I had, was I mentioned the draft ended at pick 190. What does that mean? And in 2023, there were a record number of trades. There were in the mid 40s in trades. And we had 28, 29 trades going on in this draft as well. But pick 190 was the last trade made in this draft. Pick 189 was a traded pick. It was the Eagles. The Eagles traded 8 times in this draft. They didn't even want to trade anymore. So I went back looked at the week 7, round 7, and who was drafted in those rounds and what grades I had given them as I went through and did my draft report. It really petered off. I think GMs, teams, they kind of got disinterested. This isn't one of those super COVID years where the draft was as deep as it was in 2022 and 2023. So that was one of my takeaways, is that we kind of went through the motions, I thought, at the end. And the last thing I would say in this, and let me go back to this one here. I do study GM tendencies and takeaways. I think about 20 or 22 of the 32 that I studied really came to fruition. Really trying to get a deep dive into what I thought these GMs, these organizations would do. I thought coming in that the LA Chargers would draft a different way. We'll talk about the LA Chargers later. And they drafted a completely different way to what the Chargers have been doing, in my opinion, the last few years. We saw that Atlanta ignored their edge rusher for the umpteenth time. Jacksonville did little things. They get trade value, but they kind of value different positions than I do. And their rating system is different than I do. Miami added 3 of the fastest players at their respected positions. Are we surprised at that? Not really. They're drafting for speed. Philly trades and trades and trades. If you know Howie Roseman, you know he's going to move up, down. You have to anticipate that when you're studying the draft. And if you're other owners and teams, you have to anticipate that as well. Dallas, I couldn't believe all Jerry Jones' comments about Brooks, the running back. Pretty much was going to be a done deal that Brooks wasn't going to be there when he drafted because he talked him up so much. Green Bay's tendencies, Baltimore letting the draft come to them, how they built since Ozzie Newsome. A lot of these things, even when teams made off-the-wall picks, it seemed like it was predictable. If you studied GM tendencies, it was more predictable than maybe people think.
You're missing Rams, too. They just said screw those picks again for next year by trading up big time that second rounder. I think they gave up like 2 for next year already.
Yeah, I don't remember. Yeah, I think there was a team that did that. They went to 39, I think, to get Fisher.
The Rams, right? Yeah. They just said screw those picks again.
Yeah, the Rams, to the point of giving up the future second rounder. I think that was one of the biggest hauls that had been given away for a move in the second round that we've seen in the past decade. So yeah, the Rams definitely continuing not to value future picks. And Ron, to your point about the draft ending at pick 190, That sort of like anecdotally feels true to me, just in terms of normally I can look at round 6 and 7 and kind of like feel myself a little bit excited about some of those players, or kind of like talk myself into, oh, I can see this guy having a role on this team or whatever it is. But I haven't really had that this year. There might be a couple of guys where I'm like, yeah, I can see how Dylan Laub, the running back out of University of New Hampshire. It's like, yeah, I can see how he becomes the pass catching back for the Raiders this year or in his second year or something like that. But really, like, it's kind of hard for me to find some guys who went in the second half of the third day that I actually have like any kind of positive feelings for.
Yeah, and I think that's different than most drafts for me. And so I found that fascinating, and I'm glad you hit on that. And you hit on a player when you talked about Dylan Laub that I'm curious about too. I think he just wills his way onto the roster, just the way he's built. And so I found that an interesting pick. So that was interesting. So let's talk quarterbacks then. Let me get this slide back up there. These are the 6 quarterbacks. This is the order in which they were drafted. Caleb Williams, let's talk about him first. Where is he in terms of your short-term and long-term projections? Matt, you want to start us off?
Yeah, the common comparison for him as a prospect was Patrick Mahomes, and I think a lot of that had to do with kind of like his style of play. Like, no one should expect him to have a realistic Patrick Mahomes type of ceiling, but I think like sort of like a bigger Kyler Murray feels like within like the realistic range of outcomes, and maybe like a better Kyler Murray. And so like for me, that is the ceiling. I think the situation that he finds himself in is fascinating and like fantastic for a rookie quarterback. Like, we've hardly ever seen, let me rephrase that. We've never seen a quarterback taken number 1 overall who has stepped into a situation this good in terms of the surrounding talent. I think a pretty established offensive line that might be underappreciated, great wide receivers there, 2, I think, pretty good pass catching tight ends, and a good pass catching running back. I really like the situation for Caleb Williams. I think it's hard to imagine him totally busting. I think he has a pretty high floor. So like the floor scenario for me is sort of just like a middle of the road NFL starter. It's not right to say like Trevor Lawrence because like Trevor Lawrence had such high expectations, but Lawrence to this point has kind of been a middle of the road NFL starter. And it feels like that is kind of the floor scenario for Caleb Williams.
What do you got, Dan, on Caleb? Anything to add?
Matt nailed it there. He's got a great situation. They have great picks too. He doesn't need to carry. And how many times have we seen great QBs coming out of college have to carry? Too many, and then they don't pan out. Caleb doesn't need to carry here. The divisional games for the next 2 to 5 years are manageable. Jared Goff just got paid. The Lions are probably losing Ben Johnson. We have no idea about JJ McCarthy. Jordan Love, I know he looked good at end of the year, but I need another year out of him before I fully get on that train. So at least on Caleb Williams long term, the division is manageable. They have cap space. They have some more picks next year. So the Bears can afford some mess ups here, some wiggle room. So I think he's got a relatively high ceiling, high floor. So I don't trust the coach, though. I've mentioned this before with you, Ron. He should have been fired mid-season. Then all of a sudden he won some games because they beat some very poor teams at the end. And I don't like the coach. That's the only thing I think that might hold him back for the foreseeable future. So I think he's got a great projection, or at least he won't be terrible like Bears fans think he's going to be, because the Bears have just had terrible QBs for so long. I think he's just going to be at least okay to solid QB for the future. I don't know if he's going to be the next great thing. I think he's going to be very mediocre to good long term.
I'm excited about what he showed in college, not throwing many interceptions, really trying to outscore other teams when he played on a USC team that didn't play a lot of defense. My two concerns, and one of them you partially brought up, I don't know if this coaching staff will be the one to bring the best out of him in the long range future. And I would like to see that stud offensive tackle that might be missing from Chicago. But otherwise, I like his future as well.
To follow up quickly, Ron, on what you said there, I am maybe cautiously optimistic about Shane Waldron as the coordinator there.
Okay.
And I don't know how much credit to give him for the Geno Smith renaissance that we saw in Seattle, but I feel like he deserves at least some of the credit there. And, so maybe we'll see if he can shepherd along, a rookie quarterback. But I do think that there will be a transitional period this year where Williams and Rome Odunze drafted number 9. I thought that was a great pick, where those two guys have to adapt to the NFL and the team has to adjust to having a new offensive coordinator and a new system. But I do think overall it's a positive situation.
Yeah, I like that. I'm glad you brought up Shane Waldron. That's going to be crucial right away, right out of the box, because when these quarterbacks start day one, some of them work out and some of them you wish they sat like even a Mahomes sat and learned behind Alex Smith all the good habits. And then all his athleticism took over from there and they couldn't keep him on the bench anymore, nor were they planning to keep him on the bench anymore. But sometimes it helps to sit and sometimes you're thrown right into the fire. But optimism in Chicago for sure with the whole roster. Jaden Daniels is next. He was drafted second. Dan, you want to start with what you see his ceiling and floor?
He's kind of skinny for me still. I know he weighed in at whatever weight. I'm like, he's 190 territory when he plays. That's my concern. I know some people compare him to a Lamar Jackson running. I hope they don't make him run like that. I don't think he's going to make it all 17 games a year. The Commanders were just a team who needed a lot of help this year. So it's kind of hard for me to gauge what he's going to do this year. It's more next year when they get some film on him and maybe real offense. I would have liked to see the Commanders address the offensive line some more in this draft, but they just needed so much that Jaden Daniels is another guy who doesn't necessarily have to carry his team week in and week out. So I think this is a type of guy who the schedule that comes out tomorrow, by the way, is going to play big into, because I think they're going to start kind of slow until he gets adjusted. How long it's going to take for him to adjust, I have no idea. So this is just a guy I need to see it with a bit, but potential is there. I like what the Commanders did this year in general. So hopefully they have a direction finally with a at least competent QB, because how many QBs have they had over the years? I've lost track.
Matt, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about the Commanders later, and so I'm not sure how many of my bullets I want to fire here, but it's a situation with Jaden Daniels. I think there's a really wide range of outcomes for him as a prospect, and then also for him within this offense. But him as a prospect, I think I understand the Lamar comp. I think like the running style quarterback comp that I maybe prefer a little bit more is RG3. And it's not like just because, he's on the team that's in Washington. I think Lamar was better than RG3 at protecting himself as a runner. And Jaden Daniels just seems to have like no protective instincts as a runner at all. And like that kind of terrifies me, especially because, as Dan mentioned, like he's not like whatever his weight is, like that's not real like football weight. That's not the weight that he plays at. And so, yeah, he is small, skinny rather. And so like that, I think makes me a little bit worried about his long-term ability to run in the league. But RG3, we saw what he was able to do as a rookie, and that was awesome. I do think Jaden Daniels has that as like his ceiling potential. But his floor could be, this isn't like an accurate comp. I'll just say that, but like he could be like Jake Locker, where it's like he's throwing and he's nowhere close to the targets, and all he can do is run, and he doesn't last long in the NFL. Like he could be Jake Locker type of bad in the NFL. Like I think that's within the range of outcomes.
I think I'll do the same. I'm going to hold back a couple of my bullets as well. I think it's a high ceiling for him. Similar situation to what we just talked about with Caleb. Like to see a little bit more of the offensive line developing. I just said a rookie quarterback's best friends are that big target at tight end and that offensive line to protect you, because your reads, just by nature of going into a league that's faster and stronger, you're seeing, defenses you've never seen in college. It's going to take some adjustment to want to throw into tight windows, to be able to anticipate movement, anticipate where a receiver is going to be. So I think these are learning things that he'll have to learn trial by fire. But I do think there's a high ceiling. Let's go to next is Drake May, and that's another one that we're going to be discussing New England later on. I have a floor that's dangerous with Drake May, because I think there were some bad habits in college that were formed. It's not that he was an interception machine, because we've seen worse quarterbacks come out in the first 10 picks that have thrown a lot of interceptions. I don't think Drake May is that. And I think his good tape is really, really good tape. It's just some of the other things he did when his receivers last year weren't quite as good as the receivers he had the previous year. And then I think one of the receivers, Tez Walker, he was not even in the lineup at first because of eligibility questions, so they couldn't get a rapport going with him. They ran a neat offense at North Carolina, but I think there's still a lot to learn for Drake May. It's another team where I thought New England did a good job at addressing offensive guard, offensive center in 2023, but another team that didn't really address offensive tackle, defensive-oriented staff coming in. I think we're going to see more growing pains in 2024 with Drake May as compared to the other two that we've discussed. But there still is a high ceiling for him. The real question for me is, where does he fit in the turnover scale? Is he going to tip the scale and say, we're going to see Sam Howell type turnovers, even though Sam Howell is a 5th-round pick? I don't want to necessarily compare him apples to apples. Or are we going to see somebody that in this class, this is a weird class, by the way, because we have guys with 60 starts, Bo Nix, and we have guys with 2 years, but also playoff games and championship games. This is a class deep in experience when you compare it to Richardson of 2023 with 11 starts and so on. So Drake May has a lot of starts, but he still has a lot to learn in comparison to the other 5.
I have a couple of comps for Drake May, and both of them, it's like he's the lesser version of these guys. The ceiling comp is he's a lesser Josh Allen. That's sort of like the aspirational ceiling. The floor comp is a lesser Daniel Jones. Like, I think that's kind of where he fits. But I don't hate him like as a prospect entering the league. Like, I think the Patriots got sort of lucky. Like, we'll talk about this later, but he could have been in another class. He could have been the number 1 overall pick. The Patriots were kind of lucky at the number 3 pick to be able to get a guy like Drake May. But, Ron, to your point, there's a question about whether he's lucky to end up in New England. That might not ultimately be a place that works out for him. But I think he has the raw tools. And, from a prospect perspective, I kind of don't understand why some people were down on Drake May. And I think some of it was maybe sort of like stylistically or sort of like technician looking at footwork, stuff like that. But just in terms of like the talent that he has, he can run. I think he has a sufficient arm. I think he has the potential. It's just the landing spot was suboptimal.
Mm-hmm. Want to add anything, Dan?
No.
That's
I
pretty
like
much
those.
it.
I like those comps. I have no faith in Patriots. They address some needs. We'll talk more about that, but I'm looking more into next year already for him, because this Patriots offense is not ready for him. Even if he's ready, I think this is just a scenario where you could see Drake May being the quote unquote biggest bust in this class, because the Patriots offense is just that bad. Coaching staff is questionable. So I don't know if he starts day one. I think he's better than Brissett, but I'm going to guess he sits a little bit. And hopefully when he does play, he doesn't take a beating each week because he does have nice tools, but I don't know if I trust this Patriots team yet.
Going in draft order, that brings us to McCarthy next. I think I'll let Dan take the lead with McCarthy, who rose up draft boards, because I want to save Penix so that Matthew goes first on Penix.
Well, Penix is next in draft order.
Oh, Penix is.
He is.
Remember,
You're right. You're right. Well, if somebody's draft order, thanks for the correction. So Matthew, go for it. Penix.
I mean, the Penix thing was so shocking to me, and I will say, like, I am. I tend to be a rookie optimist in terms of like how I think these guys are going to do in the league, but generally I'm a pessimist, just kind of by nature. And I was really pessimistic that we would actually see 5-6 quarterbacks go in round one. And part of that is because historically quarterbacks, if you look at mock drafts, quarterbacks tend to be over mocked. And I just thought, the sort of the prototype of Penix and Nix, those guys look like the type of quarterback who gets round one hype, but ends up going in the first 10 picks of round two. I thought that is ultimately where those guys would go and where they should have gone. But no, Penix went in the top 10, which was like, that is mind blowing enough on its own for me. And then that the Falcons took him in the top 10 after having just signed, a quarterback who looked like he should have been there for, like 3 to 5 years. Now there's a clock ticking both on needing Penix to get into the starting lineup and needing to get Kirk Cousins' contract off of the books. So we'll just have to see how that situation plays out, but that is going to impact how Penix can develop within the NFL. And I think one thing that is really weird about this is that, presumably they would hope that Kirk Cousins could be some sort of mentor to Penix. Kirk Cousins has zero incentive, like negative incentive to help Penix along. And so I don't think it's a great situation for Cousins. I think not a great situation either for Penix. But, Penix will have opportunities within the preseason and training camp because Kirk Cousins is not going to be, playing all that much, like practicing all that much in training camp. So they at least will have eyes early on Penix to see how he does within that offense. He at least has weapons around him. He has a good offensive line. He has a first-time play caller, so a little uncertain about that, but at least Zach Robinson is coming from the Sean McVay tree, the Sean McVay system. There could be some enthusiasm about that. Penix, I think, was highly system dependent with his production in college, which like that always makes me a little bit hesitant about guys, but he has a strong arm. He has shown the ability to be able to at least not inhibit his playmakers from being able to make plays. So I think he could be like a mid-range as the ceiling, like a mid-range respectable NFL starter. I mean, I don't want to make the Tua comp just because they're left-handed, but I feel like it kind of fits in that Penix is unlikely to be someone who really elevates the entire system around him. But if he's put within the right system, he could actually end up having some pretty big numbers. In that way, I think the Tua comp fits. On the low side, we're looking at a guy who like doesn't start for 2 years, gets on the field and is just not cut out for the league. And someone who should have been like Geno Smith years ago, a second round pick. And maybe he ends up being like a NFL backup for a decent amount of time, but like someone who just never really cuts it as a starter. I think like that's the floor. So like a wide range of outcomes, but I think it has very little to do with Penix as a prospect and much more to do with the circumstances in which Penix is placed.
Dan, comments?
If you're doing Penix projections, you're really projecting the Falcons 2 years from now when he probably is going to play. My guess is this season we hear Penix is going to start this week, or at least chance from the Falcons fans since they drafted him so high. I don't know if I doubt Cousins ready to go by August. Maybe by September he'll be okay because he did get hurt very late in the year, and that's a 1-year surgery or 1-year recovery type scenario with his Achilles. I'm just down on him. I don't trust the GM. I don't trust that coach. I don't really trust his team in general. So if Penix is really going to fall off a cliff, he's going to really fall off.
Before I ruptured my own Achilles, I always thought that was pretty dreaded. That how do these athletes come back? But it wasn't as bad as I thought for me. So I think at the highest level, the Rodgers and the Penix, I'm not Penix, but Cousins, they can survive with that. My thing, just to add to what you said, Matthew, my thing was right now, Penix, with the amount of experience he has and the amount of throws that he had and kind of a wide open pro style offense, he's ready as a backup right now. He could come in and play. He can give minutes. He can do things. If they give him the plate, it was interesting that you mentioned Tua and so on, because he throws those passes over the middle that I think are very much like that. I don't know if he leads people the same way Tua does, but he has that same set of skill set. He's been banged up a lot. That's been talked about, especially in his days in Indiana. And he got roughed up in the national championship game a little bit and thrown off his game. So you worry about that a little. My biggest worry, I think maybe similar to what you said, it's the organization. That's my biggest worry, because you can't keep squandering high draft picks where you have a guy who normally, if you draft an offensive tackle in the first round, you expect that person's going to play 7 to 10 years. And there's some predictability with drafting an offensive tackle in the first round. Same thing for an edge rusher. Quarterbacks far less predictable. We know that. Quarterbacks can wash out at number 1, 2, 3, whatever number that they're chosen. But I don't know how many draft choices in the first round the Falcons have wasted because they haven't picked a first round talent in the first round. Penix to me was an early second rounder, and I don't think that's necessarily, I think that's fine. Second round quarterbacks, Drew Brees was a second round quarterback, for goodness sakes. Russell Wilson, a third round quarterback in his prime, got them to a Super Bowl. It's not a knock to say you're a second round quarterback, but we know the value of quarterbacks. I think Penix has a chance to be relatively decent in this league and not a bust, but like you said, it may be a function. You put it very nicely. It may be a function of the team around him that determines his ultimate ceiling and floor. Now we get to McCarthy. So Dan, take it away.
I still can't believe he got that much hype in the process. That was a guy I was going through, and it took me forever to finally get on that train. I can't believe he went that high, but McCarthy was the type of player I had 2 grades on. If you went to Minnesota, I had a higher grade because the Vikings have a team ready now. They have an offensive line. They have weapons. They have an okay defense, probably solid depending on when you rank them. I like their head coach. The division is manageable, and he doesn't need to play right away. So that was a plus. If he went somewhere else, I was going to give him a very late round 1 grade because he's not ready, in my opinion, to play day 1. Michigan, they didn't really ask him to do much. I don't know if it's because they don't trust him or because they could get away with it. That Penn State game, if you two saw it, he threw 6 passes in the second half or something ridiculous like that. They didn't even ask him to throw. So you have a lot going for and against them. This is a guy you're probably going to have to wait until late in the year because he's probably going to be getting babysat a lot this year if he does play. But they do have the weapons in the offensive line. So next year is the year I want to see him actually start playing because I think just this year is going to have such a big learning curve that he's just, if he does play right away, I don't think he's going to be looking very good. But if you wait for him, maybe give him some more snaps, maybe wait later in the year. Maybe he just doesn't play at all this year, which I'm fine with. He's just a guy you're going to have to wait until next year to form a real opinion on. So I do like the spot. I like the organization, even though they gave up a lot of picks for next year already. But they have stuff ready for him to go day 1. He does not have to carry day 1. He's got a tight end, Ron, with Hawkinson, even though he got hurt. So he's just a guy who has a lot going right for him right now. So he doesn't need to be the guy right away. And if the Vikings aren't very good this year, it's not going to probably be his fault. It's going to be Sam Darnold's fault at least. So you have that scapegoat. But this is a guy I'm waiting for next year to form a real opinion on. But love the spot for him. Has everything ready to go, or most of the stuff.
So Matthew, when do you think McCarthy starts? Does he start week 1? When does he start?
I gently disagree with a decent amount of what Dan said. I think he starts week 1. I think he's going to be better in the NFL than people anticipate. Now, I could be falling victim to just like small sample, but I feel like in the small sample of he was dropping back to pass, they actually needed him to pass in particular games or in those situations where it's 3rd and long. I think he actually did pretty well in those circumstances. And a lot of it, to Dan's point about the system, the landing spot, that is perfect for him. But it would have been perfect for basically any quarterback in this class.
Yeah.
Minnesota was a great landing spot in general. But I do think that he fits very well within that system. And so the ceiling, which might sound really weird, but like a super version of Brock Purdy, like that I think could end up being the ceiling, but like that kind of like says it to where it's like Brock Purdy as like the last guy taken in the draft who is just able to maximize his skill set. Like that kind of reflects on the type of player that McCarthy is. Like I don't think even though he's actually an underappreciated athlete, I think he's not going to be someone who is a real dual threat who's playing out of structure and like the wizardry of Patrick Mahomes or something like that. Like we're not going to see that out of JJ McCarthy, but he could be a guy who like clinically operates the offense, and the offense based on the system. And then also just based on the supporting players he has around him, I think that could actually be a pretty good offense. But to Dan's point, it might not be something that we see right away. Like even if he starts in week 1, because I don't think it's going to be that hard to beat out Sam Darnold, but that maybe just says more about how I view Sam Darnold than how I view JJ McCarthy. But even if it's just kind of baby steps, like steady, but a medium rate progression in year 1, I think year 2 really is when we would see McCarthy come into his own. But I think he starts early. I think he's a totally fine quarterback for the system in year 1. But I do think that in year 2, he could actually be like a top 12 type of pocket passing quarterback. But that said, like he could just be what Brock Purdy should have been as the last guy chosen in the NFL draft. He could just be like, you know what? He adds nothing to the offense. He can, go through the progressions, but there's really nothing special about him as an NFL player. And he could basically end up being like Mac Jones or something like that. Like that is within the range of outcomes as well.
Yeah, it's interesting for McCarthy. I tried to separate him from the team and the player. And the first thing I come to mind is that if he were drafted last year to Carolina, he would be in the NFL 3 years and you'd never hear from him again. And if he was drafted by Houston, I don't think he has the same type of skill set as CJ Stroud. Not that any of us would have predicted that Stroud would have been that good as a rookie, but I think with that team, he would have struggled. But with Minnesota, maybe he doesn't struggle because he has this structure in place. What I saw in the offseason and at the combine and at his pro day, which I didn't watch, but just read about because I'm not that interested in pro days, but he definitely tried to take steps to gain some weight, to put more oomph into his throw, to try to do some things that scouts and teams and organizations probably thought that he needed to show. We saw a few more overthrows. I don't think he's perfect on short to medium passes. I think he's the kind of quarterback that's going to get more comfortable, similar to what you just said, Matt, in terms of year 2 versus year 1, that he's going to get more comfortable and he can grow within the system. I think he has a real chance to thrive, but I do think his game has to grow just a little bit more. So now we're on the last one. And the last one, 6 quarterbacks and 12 picks is kind of weird, but I get it. Once you had 5 go in the first 10, there's no way in this universe that Sean Payton was going to exit the first round without Bo Nix. Whether it was going to be taking him at 12, he's lost quarterbacks in the past and suffered for it, or whether he was going to trade back. The writing was on the wall once Penix was selected at 8, that Bo Nix was going to be selected earlier than people think. And I have so many different scenarios that I could say will play out with Bo Nix. First of all, he has something like 60 starts. You have to go back to the Big Ben draft where you had Philip Rivers play 4 years, play 4 bowl games, be four-time MVP in all those bowl games. Big Ben, who did amazing things and was a system fit at Pittsburgh. And then you have some guy named Eli Manning who, for a brief second, he was the number 1 pick in the draft. And then he goes to the Giants and wins 2 Super Bowls. All 4 of those guys put in their senior year of work. All 3 of those guys, they put in their senior year of work, which is unheard of in today's NFL. And then you got Bo Nix, who just gave you 60 starts. So I think we already have a ceiling for Bo Nix. It's kind of weird, but he already knows what he can do. Peyton knows what he could do. I think the best case scenario is that he is not turnover prone. He is not sack prone. He gets the ball out awfully quick. And things happen so fast that Peyton can run his offense, and he thrives because he's with Denver and is with Peyton. The floor is that if you want him to make a fourth quarter comeback and rally your team and make the key pass and get you down 80 yards in a minute 35, he may not be the guy. And so those are the I don't know if that makes sense, but those are the kinds of scenarios that come out to me. He's not going to lose you the game, and he's going to operate Peyton's system, and he's going to find the open receiver. But can he be the guy who gives you 3 or 4 fourth quarter comebacks? That I'm not so sure of. Comments about that?
I think the idea of him operating Peyton's offense, that is a big part of why he was drafted in round 1. And I do think I'm a little bit skeptical on Nix, but I think he should have been drafted in round 2, but I think he does fit well. We saw him at Oregon show the skills that is probably necessary to run Peyton's offense. And he wasn't turnover prone at Oregon. He was able to operate in timing with pretty good efficiency. So I think the ceiling, and obviously this is, I'm imagining what Peyton is seeing when he looks at Bo Nix. The ceiling is probably a decent version of latter day Drew Brees, not like Brees in the early New Orleans days, but the limited Brees who was still super efficient just because he was so familiar with the offense and was still a great timing pocket passer. So that's, I think, the best case scenario for Bo Nix. And I doubt we would get that in year 1, but we might kind of see the steps towards that in year 1. The worst case version is a guy who was just massively overdrafted, and despite the experience that he had in college, is just not really fit for a long-term starting role in the NFL. And that feels like Christian Ponder or something like that, where weak arm, can't really run an NFL offense the way you want to. Maybe he can be good enough for a couple of years, and if you have everything right around him, maybe he can end up playing in a playoff game at some point, but someone that you actually do not want as your starting quarterback.
Any final thoughts, Dan, on anything you want to add on what does Nix do year 1?
Does he have any room to grow? Is there any I feel like he's just a guy, what you see is what he is now, and that's pretty much about it. I don't think he's capable of carrying a team. He's going to have to be carried. I don't like the Broncos roster in general, so he's going to be able to execute. But Ron, I think you're spot on. Fourth quarter, he didn't win the game. Probably not going to happen.
He may be a better version of what they've had in the last couple of years, and it's a quarterback-driven league, so I understand it. I'm not thrilled with pick 12, but I understand it in this, in this scenario with quarterback-driven league. Let's move on to the wide receivers. And the exercise here was to find somebody either at the back end of round 1 or after round 1 that might be a surprise. It could be a fantasy surprise. It could be that they're going to take the team to a new win level, something good from them, and maybe even somebody who may not work out as well. So, Matt, your list is up there now. Walk us through your surprises and maybe could disappoint.
Yeah. So Lad McConkey, I thought, even though he didn't have the raw volume stats at Georgia that you would have wanted to see, he was efficient on a per snap, a per route basis. And I think we saw at the combine with his athleticism, he's probably not, or at least I'm hoping that he's not just like an Andy Isabella type. He's got the athleticism, but I do think he can play inside and outside. And I like that he's going to a quarterback in Justin Herbert, who is an established player. There's with McConkey the opportunity for him, even in a run heavy offense, to have a lot of targets coming his direction, because the wide receivers there, I really don't think there's much competition. So I do like McConkey, in terms of the opportunity and the guy who's going to be throwing to him. And I like McConkey's skill set. Jermaine Burton, I think it's a nice fit for him in Cincinnati. Highly recruited guy, played at Georgia, played at Alabama, was the number one receiver at Alabama for his 2 years there. And I think there's the possibility he slots in right away as one of the starting 3 receivers for Joe Burrow. I do think that he has the versatility to play inside if they want him to kind of just assume the Tyler Boyd role, but he also has the ability to play outside. And with T. Higgins on a 1-year deal, there's a possibility that Burton, if he plays well this year, really could be the number 2 receiver for Joe Burrow next year. And then Luke McCaffrey, third rounder, famously brother to Christian McCaffrey. And this isn't as simple as, hey, he's basically Christian McCaffrey in the slot, but he's got athletically, just like mirror image athleticism of Christian McCaffrey in terms of like the body, the speed, the agility. At the combine, he exhibited Christian McCaffrey like athleticism. I like that he was a college quarterback, so he has like the cerebral way of looking at the game. And then in his 2 years after transitioning from quarterback to wide receiver, his 2 years as a receiver, his first year, he was the number 1 player at Rice in terms of receptions. And his second year, just number 1 receiver in terms of everything. And it was a gulf between him and the number 2 receiver at Rice in his second season. So, you can look at him and say he was like a later college breakout, but basically the moment he became a wide receiver, he was a really good player. And so I still think that there's room for him to grow in the NFL as a technician, as a route runner, but I think he could be really good right away in the slot, and then maybe in a Cooper Kupp kind of way, become a better route runner who is able eventually to win on the perimeter because of his technique. But I think even right away in the slot, he could end up being a really good player. And this is a random thing, but one thing I like to look for with wide receivers is guys who are still good running the ball, because I think it speaks to a wider skill set, where the coaches just look at this guy and say, we need to get him the ball any way that we can. And Luke McCaffrey, even though he was playing wide receiver for his final 2 seasons, he would still get the ball a couple of times a game as a runner. And he did well in those situations. So I think that just kind of speaks to a well-rounded skill set. And like, it would not surprise if McCaffrey, at least it would not surprise me if McCaffrey ended up having a couple of really good seasons in the league, sort of like, I don't want to say like a Hunter Renfrow type, where he's not your number 1 receiver on the team, but whenever you need to get the ball to someone in the middle of the field on third down, he ends up delivering for you. So I do like McCaffrey. And then I'll say the guy who I think could disappoint, Xavier Legette. I think he's overdrafted at the end of round 1. And I think there was also a process mistake where the Panthers did not need to trade up 1 pick to get him, from the top of round 1 to the end of top of round 2 to the end of round 1. And then just in terms of him as a prospect, he has intriguing size and speed, but there are always guys like that in the draft. And the fact that he did not produce until his final college season is a massive red flag to me. So I just kind of like, I made the joke of, I don't know why you would draft Xavier Legette when you have Jonathan Mingo because like, but like Legette is sort of Mingo-esque in terms of like the analytical profile. I just think it was a significant overdraft on a player like I would have zero interest in. So yeah, that's how I'm looking at those wide receivers.
Yeah, I find that all valid points. I'll have more to say about McCaffrey later when we get into Washington, but worry about McConkey's health. He wasn't on the field 100%, but boy, route runner, all kinds of good things there. And it's kind of like you read my draft report. I mean, he just didn't have a first round grade on my board, and that was to me a little bit of an overdraft, but we've seen that from San Francisco before. Here's my list. I put a couple in the could surprise area, and one is even surprising that I put him in there. Starting with the second one there, Keon Coleman. If you looked at my draft grade, I looked at my own draft grade, and I had him graded as a second round talent. So he was properly drafted. I kind of put him in closer to the 35 to 40 range as opposed to where he was drafted, 33 or so. So, it's right in the same range, but I didn't have him as a first round pick. He didn't run particularly fast. So why do I think he's under the radar if he was properly drafted? It's pretty much because of two factors. Number one, I fully endorse the fact that Buffalo understands now that Josh Allen is a high ball thrower, and he's better suited to throwing to guys like Keon Coleman with his size and contested catch ability. He's had these home run threats in Gabriel Davis. He has some slot receivers, but the best usage of somebody is with the size and the skill set of Keon Coleman. And I think that's a good fit for the organization. And then Diggs, who quit on him last year, the last 6, 7, 8 games. And I would argue that Josh Allen quit on Diggs as well. He stopped putting him into the food chain in terms of actually getting the ball to him. And their win record actually got better. Remember, they were 6-6, and then they practically ran the table in order to make the playoffs. And that was a lot without Diggs. So they pretty much changed their wide receiver room. And now they have three of their top 4 receivers are gone. So great opportunity for Coleman. As for Corley, it's funny because I don't think I've ever used this terminology before, but in one of my needs for the New York Jets, I wrote scat back wide receiver. I wanted a certain kind of wide receiver who could run a route, get to a spot, and Aaron Rodgers could hit him in the spot because Aaron Rodgers is very much a timing quarterback. He's not what Josh Allen needs. It's what Aaron Rodgers needs. And maybe Corley is the best definition I have in this draft of what a scat back wide receiver looks like. So based on that alone, I had to put him in my under the radar. I don't know how much Aaron Rodgers will trust him as a rookie. I know he trusts him to live in the same house right now. Apparently he's renting part of his, I don't know where he is, in the basement or somebody, but he's living with Aaron Rodgers pretty much right now. So that's good trust to start with. Maybe they're throwing some pitch and catch on the side there. But I think this is just a great system fit for an organization that's really concentrated on improving their offense in this offseason. Now, similar with my could disappoint, Polk, I have nothing terribly negative to say about Polk. I think he's a potential high-level number 2 receiver who probably shouldn't have been drafted as high as 37 as he was to New England. He enters a situation where may turn out to be the kind of quarterback that Polk thrives with, but it's also going to be a lot of growing pains. We've talked about New England already. We're going to talk about them some more. It's not an ideal offensive situation for 2024 that Polk gets to. There's always going to be somebody that's going to be better than Polk out there on the field, I think. if Polk has one of those Jordan Jefferson types on the other side, or if he has a Tyreek Hill on the other side, it maximizes Polk's value to do the dirty work. And Polk's a good blocker. He's a good route runner. He's a good hands catcher. He has all those things. But as far as a number one quarterback, a number one wide receiver for a quarterback to throw to, it's just, I don't see that right now.
It's interesting. I agree with you on Polk as like an ideal number two, and so could be miscast as the number one. And then just quickly following on the two guys you mentioned that could surprise, Malachi Corley. Yeah, I agree totally with the assessment of sort of like scat back wide receiver. I think it's a really interesting way of putting it, and it feels like the idealized version of that. Like people will talk about Deebo Samuel and like that comp makes sense, but for Aaron Rodgers, like the ideal version of that was Randall Cobb, like peak Randall Cobb back in the day. And so it's a question of like, can Corley be Randall Cobb, or is he going to be like Amari Rodgers if we're thinking of sort of like past Aaron Rodgers wide receivers?
Yeah.
And then the other wide receiver you mentioned, I'm blanking. Oh, Keon Coleman. Kelvin Benjamin feels like the comp where, like if Keon Coleman ends up winning, it's going to be like your big bodied X receiver who maybe can't get great separation, but is just so dominant at the catch point. And your point about like Josh Allen being like a high ball thrower, and you need that guy with the big wingspan to catch those passes. If Keon Coleman has success, it is because he is able to win at the contested catch point. And if he doesn't, it's because he maybe should be a big bodied slot receiver instead of an X.
Okay. Absolutely fair. Let's go to Dan. You have some things you may want to add, because a lot of these people may have been on your list already. And, but you did, or let's see, I think I have it here. There we go. We have your list up there.
So we don't have Ricky Pearsall on this slide. I added him late, but Adonai Mitchell, Keon Coleman, and Ricky Pearsall are all three guys that came to mind that could be under the radar. All three of those guys go to a solid team with a solid quarterback and at least solid coaching staff. So at least I think they're going to get the help they need. Of those three, Adonai Mitchell and Ricky Pearsall are probably not starting right away. Adonai Mitchell fell because he had the character concerns, and we saw the Chris Ballard lashing out clip. I don't know if you guys saw that or not. I thought it was a little weird by him because Ballard usually doesn't like character concerns. But Adonai Mitchell there mid-round two, maybe he couldn't pass up here, and maybe the character concerns are maybe overblown, maybe manageable. Maybe it was just a nothing burger because it is the NFL draft process and everything gets blown out of proportion because we're just bored. But Adonai Mitchell is going to be taking Alec Pierce's spot probably late in the year because Pierce is just not it. Ricky Pearsall, I thought that was a pick the Niners just either overdrafted or just told you that they're going to be letting go of either Deebo Samuel or Ayuk. I don't know who's going to be of those two. I think one of those are going to be gone next year, and he's going to be able to sit and then develop with time behind those two. He doesn't need to carry. Keon Coleman, my concern with him is he might need to carry day one because the Bills wide receivers just aren't very good, and that's why we have the asterisks there. If he's capable of carrying, I think he's going to be a solid type of player, good for Josh Allen. But if he can't carry day one, I'm going to have my real concern for him long term. And I left the could disappoint slide blank because you two already had it. Jalen Polk, I thought it was a reach there. I thought he was more productive because his team was really solid, and now he needs to go to the Patriots and carry. Not a fan of that. Leggett, are they going to actually use him? That was the argument I heard. I'm like, I don't trust his coaching staff. I don't trust Bryce Young to get him the ball on top of that. It just seems like the Carolina Panthers doubled down on nothing. Why did you double down on that wide receiver? Why did you trade up? It's just, if Leggett is bad, I think he's going to be real bad and out of the league real soon. So those were the guys that came to mind here. All three of them could be productive. All three of them could be mediocre at best. But the two disappointments were the ones where I think they need to be productive day one, or they're just going to be out of the league. I just don't trust those coaching staffs, though. So I think you two covered the disappointments well. But Leggett one, that's the one I keep going back to. The owner told me they were going to take him, and I thought he was just joking, but I don't know why he traded up for him.
Yeah. It was interesting the way that developed. It was interesting the way this was considered a pretty good wide receiver class. I had probably from picks 5 or 6 to 14 pretty bunched together. Some teams decided to ignore wide receiver altogether, which puzzled me, but some took these different interchangeable players. We'll just have to see how it actually plays out. The last part of what we're going to do today is really fascinating to me. 3 teams with new beginnings. And we go with the Chargers because they have a new coach, new coordinators, new GM, kind of borrowing from Baltimore and Michigan in both cases. We're going to go to New England, life after Bill Belichick, and then we're going to go to Washington, which is a completely different change. So I think I got the straw where I'm starting with the LA Chargers and covering 3 areas here with Jim Harbaugh taking over. Situation upon takeover. Well, for me, Staley is out of the building. The coach is out of the building. Poor decision maker, risk reward, didn't understand down and distance, said he was, basically the guy in terms of getting the defense to play at the premium level, but the defensive stat sheet showed kind of a below average tackling. We saw a run defense that couldn't stop the run. They fixed their special team play finally, but they didn't trust them at times going for it on 4th down in bad, down and distance situations. And they also inherited, I think the new coach, Jim Harbaugh, inherited a team that was really, really good, really great track record of drafting in the first round, but not a good track record of drafting after the first round. And we know from the previous GM that they didn't use a phone, they didn't trade. 6 of the last 8 years, they didn't pick up the phone to change their roster. Not that much done in free agency. Completely applaud what they did every round 1 of the draft, but nothing thereafter. What are my impressions right now? Higher than most people. If you just look at the draft itself, I thought they hit every need on my board. I thought they drafted the Jim Harbaugh way. You want guys with sound tackling technique. He drafts as the Michigan linebacker, Colson. Absolute sound tackling technique. These guys are going to stuff the run like they haven't before. They've restocked at running back to be kind of a power running back team. They've got Dobbins. They got a guy from this draft. They hit the hole and they get some yards after contact. He wants this team to be very physical. I think he drafted in that direction. Sure, tacklers, hitting my need board. Is it going to all come together right away? That we're going to have to wait and see. I actually graded this draft in my top 5, in my top 3, which is not what other people did, but I thought they hit their board the way they wanted to. This is one thing we haven't brought up. We might bring up later, but we know the schedule comes out tomorrow. As we tape this, we're 24 hours away from the schedule coming out. Teams that buy in early, and Jim Harbaugh, he's the kind of guy you either buy in or you think he's all fluff, who has it better than us, that kind of mantra. But if they buy in early, winning early really sets the tone. I'm curious to see what that first schedule layout is like. What's the first month looking like? When's that pivotal new coach bye week coming? These are things I'm going to be looking for. I think they can win this year, and I think they will win in 2005 and beyond. I think why I feel that way is attention to detail and coaching upgrades. I'm very bullish on the Chargers. Thoughts?
Matt, you go first. I'm joking over here.
Yeah. I think that their offense will have a really high floor with Greg Roman and with Harbaugh. Both of those guys have had success wherever they've gone, and they've had success together previously with the 49ers. But I do think they're going to have a really run-heavy offense that turns Justin Herbert into a glorified game manager, sort of like a super version of Alex Smith. And I think that's going to cap the offense's explosiveness. And maybe that's kind of what they want. They want a ball control type of system and try to win a lot of tight games. versus get into shootouts. And I think that, like, I can understand that given what they have on the roster, especially in the offseason, partying with Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Gerald Everett at tight end, Austin Eckler at running back, and building with Gus Edwards as your main lead back, adding J.K. Dobbins. I get it. I think this offense could be fine, and especially having Rashawn Slater as your left tackle, adding Joe Alt at right tackle, like that could end up being like an ass kicking offensive line, and so you if you have that, I can understand, hey, let's run the football and then let's count on Justin Herbert to be an efficient guy when we need him. And we're going to rebuild the culture here, and we're going to win some close ball games and more games than we won last year. Like, I can understand that. It just, you are limiting what you can do on offense. And I still think it's an offense driven league. So I think they will have some success, but I just don't think it's going to be wild success.
Dan.
Kudos to the Chargers. I didn't think they were going to do it with Joel at pick 5. I was waiting to see it, and they did it. Kudos to them. I think you both nailed it. I think it's going to be a solid team, a productive team, much better without Staley, because that team quit on him. I don't like to use that word, but they flat out quit on that Thursday game when the Raiders dropped 60 some odd points. I just don't. This is a team I want to see the schedule with. Could they start slow? Yes. There's a learning curve here, but I think back half of the season, if that schedule breaks right, this is a team I think you'd see playing well. But I have nothing else really to add.
I think, to your point, Matt, that there are some changes that Jim Harbaugh is going to have to make, and he's going to have to make it with the NFL in mind and not with the Michigan offense, and that you could bully other Big Ten defenses in mind, where you don't have to throw. You could be a game manager. He has the quarterback where he can let it loose a little bit more. And I think with San Francisco, if he falls back to the Colin Kaepernick days and so on, he will trust his quarterback a little more, because if he doesn't, you're right, there's going to be a ceiling to what he accomplishes. But I just see this as a major positive to get out of the Staley rut that was there, and just actually making a tackle every once in a while is going to propel this team to better their record, like you had mentioned.
I'll say, with the schedule coming out, it will be a real shame if we don't have the Chargers and the Chiefs playing at the end of the season, within the final 4 weeks of the season. Because the Chargers, this feels like the kind of team that, like, once they get into this certain mindset and things really coalesce with the offense, like, it's not actually hard to imagine them rolling into Kansas City in December and punching the Chiefs in the face. Like, I can imagine that happening. And, like, from the sports betting perspective, it's like, I'm looking forward to the idea of potentially betting on that.
Yeah, I like that comment. And people have heard me say, when you play a team matters. And when that first bye is, I don't want the new coach bye to be like Arizona's was last year, week 12 or something like that, with no Thursday game, because not all teams are required to play on Thursday. When can this totally new staff actually make adjustments? For Arizona, it was way too late. But if the Chargers get what you say, some, amped up divisional games late in the year and a week 5 or 6 bye, and they've made their adjustments, this is going to be a fun December, January to watch. So I hope that happens, but they've made the schedule without me. We'll see what happens, how that comes into play. New England is next. Who gets the lead on New England? We have Dan, I think, taking the lead on New England. Life after Bill Belichick.
My computer's going slow. One moment. There we go. This was a draft I looked at. All those positions, all those picks were of need, and getting Drake May some help. That's what I took away. Whether or not these guys actually pan out is a different question. Whether or not this coaching staff pans out is another question. I do wonder about this team. This is another team we need to talk schedule with. If that schedule is front loaded, I think this is a team where a lot of people kind of write off early, saying that they suck. But if that back half of schedule is kind of manageable, these players will have more reps, more time. Coaching staff will have more time to prep, or at least a system under the belt. So this is just a team I want to see the schedule with. But if Drake May isn't it, I don't know if he's going to be able to carry all year. Those two offensive linemen in round 3 and round 4 are going to have to develop real fast because the Patriots offensive line was not very good last year. And I think the Patriots defense next year or this year, I think they got a lot of help from Bill Belichick, the coach, because they were still at least competing and competitive. They just had no help week in and week out last year from that bad offense not being able to score or hold on to the ball. So I'm kind of pessimistic, but if they are a 5 or 6 win team, I wouldn't be that surprised. If they are drafting for more offensive linemen and wide receivers again next year, I wouldn't be surprised because they do have some nice pieces on defense at least. But this is just a draft that I could see them kind of somewhat copying again next year because they still need a lot of wide receiver help and they still need offensive line help. But I do like that they have some pieces for Drake May here.
Matt.
I'm pretty pessimistic about this team. And, let's start with the defense. You have super continuity on the defensive unit, and I think that is good. But and I'll say you even have some continuity on the defensive staff, even with Belichick leaving. Gerard Mayo was there. Their new defensive coordinator, DeMarcus Covington, he was the DL coach there last year. So you have some continuity in terms of the coaching and great continuity with that unit. They're basically bringing the entire unit back. So that is good. But Bill Belichick, has famously been able to maximize his talent with the units that he's had. I don't know if the combination of Mayo and Covington is going to be able to maximize that defense. So I think even though they have continuity there, the defense probably takes a step back. And then you look at the offense, and that could just be a travesty. Some people look at Van Pelt as the coordinator and say he's never been a play caller. I think that's not right. He was actually a play caller once, and that was 2009 with the Bills. And if you look at what they had there, it was actually a pretty decent assortment of talent. You had Ryan Fitzpatrick near his peak. You had Fred Jackson and Marshawn Lynch as the running backs. You had Terrell Owens and Lee Evans, and that offense finished number 27 in yards per play. And I just think as a play caller, Van Pelt might not have it. And even if let's assume as a play caller, he's gotten better, even though he's never called plays since then, just naturally being in the league, seeing other guys, being around other strong play callers, maybe he's gotten better at play calling, but it is still such a paltry collection of talent on the offensive side of the ball that I'm just really pessimistic. And I think it's going to be a slow, run-heavy offense that's coordinated by a really unproven play caller that has a potentially rookie left tackle protecting. And this isn't like a first-round left tackle. This is a third-round left tackle protecting a rookie quarterback. It just feels like there are so many ways that this could go poorly. And that's not even talking about the dearth of talent that they have at wide receiver, legitimately probably the worst wide receiver room in the league. I'm really skeptical about how this turns out for the Patriots.
Well, I think you guys have said a lot of what I would say. The floor is first round pick in 2025. I mean, this could be bad. What did Bill Belichick leave them? Although I still think that when he drafted 12 players last year, his intent was not to leave, but things worked out that he ended up being forced to leave. Offense was at rock bottom by the end of last year. Of course, they've had some curious coordinator hires during that time period, etc. Even the vaunted special teams unit, which used to be at the peak, took a couple of years off. I mean, 31st or 32nd in 2023, not much better last year. A decade of draft misfires, which is Bill Belichick's fault, unfortunately, with a bunch of blown wide receiver picks. He coached them up, especially in the secondary. His pride and joy was getting these guys in the right formations, drafting some smart players, but the talent level that he drafted wasn't great. So that's what he left him. And what are my impressions so far? Not that much higher. You guys mentioned a left tackle. He's not even a true left tackle. They, that's a problem. They've got some guys that are going to be making position switches, and the coaching staff better be up to speed into how that happens. There were more wasted draft picks. We don't have to get into the Joe Milton talk about what kind of an arm he has, but why are you drafting a quarterback right now when you have so many different needs? Why are you drafting a cornerback who's not even rated for me? I think the South Carolina kid Dial did not receive a draft-worthy rating from me. So that, to me, they're still misfiring in the draft. And now they're going to have to rely on guys coming off injury. Matthew Judon, very good pass rusher coming off a serious injury. They didn't sack a lot of quarterbacks when he was out of the lineup. They had basically one per game after he went down with injury. Now they're going to rely on him and whatever else they did in the offseason, not a lot to increase their pass rushing prowess. So I think we're going to see more misses than hits in 2024. Are they going to miss Bill Belichick, the teacher, beyond that? This is really on May's shoulders, for better or for worse, not his fault. But, he's going to have to help carry the team because I don't think there's a lot of talent surrounding him. So I'm kind of bearish on him, just kind of like what I hear out of you, Matt. We've got one more team, and to me, it's a fascinating team, and that's going to be the Washington Commanders. Not only have they changed their name, they've changed their owner, they've changed a lot of things. So go ahead and get us started. What's Washington's state of the union right now, if you will?
Yeah, you mentioned it. New owner, new coach. And maybe not even the coach that they actually wanted, but Dan Quinn is the coach that they got. And with Quinn coming in, defensive coach, that means he needs to bring in an offensive coordinator, and that's Cliff Kingsbury. And there's a question as to how effective Cliff Kingsbury actually was as a play caller, as a coordinator with the Cardinals back in the day. But and the defense, I think, is solid. They didn't really do much in the draft to kind of bolster the defense. They did add defensive tackle Jerzon Newton, which kind of makes me think that, maybe Jonathan Allen ends up getting traded. They did add Mike Sanistil, who I think is probably going to end up being their starting nickel. But the defense is kind of in place. And I think Dan Quinn, if what he was able to do in Dallas is any indication, and maybe it's not any indication, but if he's able to do something comparable here to what he did in Dallas, this defense, should be league average, I think, at the worst, and maybe kind of approaching, top 12, top 10. The offense, there's a lot of uncertainty here. Now, I think you look at all of these different units in isolation, and you would say they are at least league average or thereabouts at offensive coordinator, offensive line, and skill position group. The problem is they have a rookie quarterback, a new scheme, a new play caller, and as many as 6 new offensive starters. So you could have a situation where all of this coalesces, and this is a really great situation where, let's say, if all that happens is Kingsbury and Jaden Daniels really click, this could be a top 10 offense, right? Like, it could be an above average unit if those two really hit it right. But if those two don't, then you just have this collection of all of these new players in a new system, new quarterback, new play caller, and things could go really poorly. So I can see how it goes well. And even mediocrity would be an improvement on what this team had last year. And that's probably what we get, a league average type of offense. But I think it's going to be volatile, and it could take some time to get there with all of these new pieces coming together.
What do you got, Dan?
I think Matt nailed it. It just seems like this team has a wide range of outcomes on offense, at least. I did want to see them add more offensive line talent with 2 of their second round picks. They didn't add another offensive tackle until round 3. But the potential's there. The potential's also there for them to be really bad on offense to start with, at least. This is another team I want to see that schedule on. If they get a brutal 5, 6, 7 weeks, I think this is an offensive team who you could see starting 1-6, 2-5, maybe if they're lucky. But I think the new owner, because this is the first real offseason, that new owner last year came in pretty late in the process. Ron Rivera is gone. I do think him being gone is good because everyone knew he was just a lame duck coach. And just as a player, why would I listen to you? So this team got the real hard reset that they wanted from last year. But I need to see it with a lot of this team, the offense in particular. If it takes time for them to gel, I don't think Daniels is going to be looking very good to start with.
Yeah, if you go back to the trading deadline and see what happened from there till the end of the year, it was brutal. I mean, they got rid of their two best edge rushers. I mean, they basically said, we're done for 2023. And in a sense, they went 0-8. They were outscored 2-1 ratio. They won one home game the whole year. They did not win any divisional game. The ownership, we know how people felt in their own organization about their owner. I mean, this was as rock bottom as you could start a franchise with. And where they are now, to me, it's one word, it's culture. They have absolutely started the rebuild by changing the culture. Does that mean they're going to flip the switch and win? No, I think, Dan, you hinted at that. Matt, you hinted at that. The roster is not complete right now. I wanted 2 offensive linemen. I wanted another edge rusher. I wanted another cornerback. We got one of each. They actually hit all their need areas, but I would have doubled up on some of their primary need areas. So there's still work to be done. But going back to McCaffrey, for example, was he the best receiver left on the board when he was picked? No, even though I appreciated when he was picked because I had under 132.5, but that's a different story. But I think what they got is they got a cultural fit. They did that with the Michigan guy, Sandstro, as well. They got a cultural fit, somebody who is going to take the organization to another level in terms of, where it is. It's just not going to be a team of misfits anymore. It's not going to be these people who either motivationally or whatever else. This is an organization that's going to play hard. They're going to try hard. They're going to turn the corner from their old owner. So I think McCaffrey, who's willing to go over the middle, and I think you mentioned that as well when you talked about McCaffrey, I think he brings a good skill set to this particular team. So I'm not displeased that they left better receivers on the table. I think this is a good fit for them. And I think every position that they filled in free agency and in the draft was done with culture in mind and with fit in mind, even more than it was for let's get the top player at each position. This is, like you said, we don't know what the schedule is. I'm not that optimistic for 2024 because I have a concern about Cliff Kingsbury. I think you mentioned that too. I think he leaves his quarterbacks open to get hits. I think he wants to get fancy with these reads and with everything, and he can get a quarterback killed. He practically got Kyler Murray killed, and Daniels, who's built to run an offense similar to Kyler Murray, might have some of those playground type 80-yard plays where he escapes the pocket and he rolls around and he finds the guy because he's that talented. My concern is, why does he have to be that talented? Why not you get him a better offensive line? Why not design a scheme that's going to work and not put him in peril? So I'm curious to see how Cliff Kingsbury does in this offense. 2024 may or may not work, but I'm absolutely fascinated what this organization done, and I'm really rooting for them in the short and long term.
Ron, to your point quickly about Kingsbury, yeah, he doesn't do his quarterbacks any favors. He doesn't scheme wide receivers open. There's very little pre-snap movement within his offense. I mean, just thinking back to the days with the Cardinals, DeAndre Hopkins would play like 90% of his snaps on one side of the field. I mean, there was just very little that was inventive with that offense. So we'll see. Maybe there are some changes, but yeah, that's part of my pessimism.
Yeah, I don't know short term what it does, and I don't know if Kingsbury's the right hire. It's going to be fun to watch, but scary at the same time. I'm optimistic for them. I'm much more optimistic with them than, for instance, the New York Giants for different reasons. So, first thing they have to do is get grounded, start winning home games, start building up that momentum. As soon, one win gets the second win, the third win. When do new coaches get their first win is always a very interesting thing for me, because if it takes 2 or 3 games, it might take 5 or 6 or 7 games. Closing thoughts. We're kind of near the end now. We've covered a lot of ground, and we've hopefully brought up some very interesting points. What are your closing thoughts, Matt, Dan?
Matt, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I would say, with the schedule coming out, we've talked about the schedule and, the things that I will be looking for, the home and away splits, when are teams playing some of their games at home? Who are they playing some of their home games versus away games? Or all of the tough matchups at home or away? And how many games in a row, like the sequencing, are some of these teams going to be playing 3 games in a row on the road, 3 of 4, 4 of 5, 5 of 7? And then in those situations, are there opportunities for teams to cut down on travel by staying out west or out east? Looking at distance traveled, which is, correlated with travel sequencing, but, there's a difference between a team playing 4 or 5 games on the road, but all of them are on the East Coast and they're an East Coast team. Looking at division sequencing, when a team is playing its divisional games, how many of them are in a tight time frame? Looking at rest advantage and disadvantage, just kind of looking at the situational spots, which, I think for any given game might not really be, as impactful as some people might think. But if you add up all of those over the course of a season, might end up coming out to, half a win or a full win. And if we're thinking of the win total markets, that actually ends up making a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan?
Just take Matt's idea a step further. I think of front half and back half, and how is your depth? Playing the Dolphins in September, not the same team as December. They have no depth on offensive linemen. So just because you have Dolphins on this schedule, if you get them late in the year, that's not going to be the same team. Colts are another team. How good is Anthony Richardson? Is he going to play all 17 games? Is he going to play more than 4 games this year? That's another issue I have. So when I do the schedule, I want to see who you're playing and when. We talked about the rookies. Are you playing them early? Are you playing them late? Do they have depth? It's just a bunch of little stuff that we go on and on. But I am much more interested in first half and second half than I am maybe more home and away, just because we know these teams change week to week. But long term, I want to see some of these teams who have no depth or a lot of depth come to life. So I'm going to be looking for the back half of the schedule more likely than the first half, but bye weeks is another one I want to see. Ron, rookies, they need a break at some point. Arizona got it late. Or another one I like to look at is when you add so many pieces like the Commanders, the Cardinals, we're missing somebody else here. When you add that much talent, when do they fully start to gel? The Cardinals and the Commanders just need the players at this point. So if you draw them later in the year, you're probably going to be better than perceived first beginning of the year. Or a team like the 49ers, they're already hurt to start with. We've not even kicked off a single week yet with Greenlaw getting hurt with the torn Achilles in the Super Bowl. Does Debo play all year? Kittle's another year older. That's just another team who on paper looks really good, but they don't have much depth. So if you get them late in the year and them in playing 5, 6, 7, 8 games, they're probably not going to be 100%. Another team, Browns, what's Watson going to do? So that is stuff I am looking for. I'm going to see the first to second half of the schedule.
I love everything Dan just said there. Wanted to echo that. I think that's great. Thinking about first half, second half of the season, and when you're playing specific teams within the schedule. Love that.
Yeah, there's letdown games, there's revenge games, there's a lot of things going in. You mentioned the home away splits. The schedule is the last data point that I need and that we need. And we've assessed any scheme changes that a team is going to be doing in terms of offense, defense, drastic change like Atlanta run-centric team, and now they drafted, well, not worrying about Penix, but they took Kirk Cousins. That's a unique change there. Roster overload like Washington, rebuilding that roster and so on. Bill Belichick not there and so on. We've seen what they've done in free agency. There are still holes after the draft. We've assessed the draft. I'm looking at which players are ready to start right away versus which aren't. From essentially next week until the beginning of August, there's nothing left for me to assess. So therefore, I have pulled the trigger on some season wins, some divisional matchups, and as far as who's going to win the division and so on and so forth. And I have not pulled the trigger on a number of things, waiting for that final piece coming in 24 hours. So a lot of stuff has happened. My spreadsheet is ready. We're finally to that last data point where maybe some of us can go to Hawaii or do something else for a little bit of time instead of staring in the computer. But I know I have some things that are coming up. I'm going to be doing some 10 and 20-minute draft recaps and setting the stage, and maybe letting people know some of my personal thoughts. Matt, what do you have coming up, if anything, in the before we get to the real season?
Yeah, so just waiting for that schedule to drop. Won't have to wait long, and then once it does, projecting out, pretty much all of those games. 272 games. So having the power ratings, looking at all the situational spots, putting all that stuff in the right sequential order in the spreadsheet for the games, and then just doing the projections and seeing how it all comes out. And so that will give me my win total projections, and I'll have projections for division, who wins division, who wins the Super Bowl, just kind of going all out on that. So that is coming up. And then, also on the fantasy side, at Fantasy Life, we will have a magazine that is coming out, that, wherever it is that people buy magazines nowadays, somehow people still buy fantasy magazines, to get ready for your fantasy football drafts. And so, you'll be able to find that, Target, Walmart, wherever. That's coming out in June, the beginning of June. And so, just
that's
kind of
fast.
Yeah. So just, doing the work, as a content creator, especially, for fantasy, July, that's when stuff really starts to ramp up with people, drafting all summer long, and, consuming as much fantasy content as they can. So, I have rankings for fantasy at Fantasy Life. I'll have season long projections for all of the guys at Fantasy Life, and you can find all of that there.
So Dan said in a tweet, he said, no days off. So you really took that to heart.
Yeah.
Dan, do you have any days off coming up, or what are you up to get ready for the NFL?
I want to be like, I have something cool here, but I'm just going to sit at home, fire up some projects, go to the gym. My routine's pretty much set for the NFL season year round, because in college basketball, it was a Thursday, Saturday scenario. So I was always prepping for that. So my schedule doesn't change almost at all. I just get a little bit more hot because I'm in Indiana. It gets a little bit more humid. Maybe go outside some more, and maybe go socialize this summer, because last summer I did not socialize at all. I told myself this year I have to go outside. So the final thing I'm going to wait for is that schedule. That's the one where I really want to see who you're playing late in December. And Matt got me fired up for a possible Chargers Chiefs scenario in December, but I think that's already been determined. So we're hoping we're getting it. But honestly, nothing. Fire some up old projects, go outside a little bit. That's about it.
Yeah, well, I'll hone in on my final things. I'll have a schedule analysis article or two coming out. Hopefully, we'll see how that develops, but maybe in a week or so. Important document for me, puts the finishing touches on my work, and I can say I won't be as busy for the next 6 weeks after that. So that'll be pleasing to me. But basically, I want to thank both of you for agreeing to participate in this exercise as we went through a unique quarterback class, 6 of the first 12, which has certainly never been done. An interesting wide receiver class, whether it be for fantasy or whatever, and then 3 organizations that are going to look drastically different, I think, than they have in the past. When you don't have Bill Belichick in the building, when you have a Jim Harbaugh in the building, and when you don't have a Washington owner in the building that's been there for over 2 decades, these organizations are going to be drastically different. So I thank everybody who watched and listened. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Dan. And we'll hook up again down the road. Follow us, look at what we're up to, and good luck to everybody. And thanks for watching.